our final session, where we were very keen to recognise that it's the 70th anniversary of Keynes' actual death, and he was a most remarkable person. And there was much more to his life than the general theory and economics, and we also knew that he was a great financial speculator and financial market practitioner at an insurance company, and Lord Macpherson told interesting tales about his grandfather being Keynes' stockbroker. So I thought it was appropriate we should end the morning with a serious crack from Lord Skidelsky as Keynes' biographer, and also people who've actually written extensively about and thought a lot about Keynes as an investor, who themselves have a lot of practical experience in dealing with investment. Now, Lord Skidelsky has thought more, written more, and everything more about Maynard Keynes than anybody else, and needs no introduction from me. David Thornton worked in the financial markets for a long time. He, in fact, was the part of the team that used to advise the investment committee of the Royal Borough of Kensington Chelsea, and is a very experienced financial market journalist, and has written about Keynes as an investor. John Woods was an academic for many years, and likewise has actually had a lot of practical experience as an institutional investor. I'm not producing you, I hope, in any way by that, and has given a lot of thought to this and written extensively about Keynes as an investor. And Elroy Dimson has been the most distinguished financial market academic at the London Business School, and is now, I think, actually
Cambridge nowadays.
Crept away to Cambridge for still a very vigorous and active life, and likewise has taken a great interest in Keynes. Now, I thought the best thing to do to set us going would be to ask Robert to actually talk about Keynes as a personality, his public life, and what he thinks would be appropriate today to actually draw our attention to.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me. Let me start with two quotes. First, from Keynes's wife, Lydia. Keynes was more than an economist. And secondly, from John Stuart Mill, anyone who's only an economist will never be a very good economist. And if that's true, then we don't have a rather depressing outlook for our profession, because these people are more and more narrow. The discipline has become more and more specialized. It's become more and more mathematical and self-enclosing. Virginia Woolf noted about Keynes his queer imaginative ardor about history, humanity, his mind overflowing vigorously into pathways. So, I mean, I think that's the first thing to note about Keynes, so the broadness of his interest and the broadness of his education, in which he matches people, contemporaries, who almost disappeared, like Schumpeter, Hayek, and they were very broadly educated, and they all saw economics through a quite wide spectrum, and therefore its place through their education. Second point I'd like to make, Keynes was a product of decaying Victorian conventions, and that's what made the problem of personal behaviour so important to him. He really had a terrific optimism about the new dawn after the death of Queen Victoria, and that was shattered by the First World War. What other bits of the Victorian? He was quite frugal in his personal habits. That's a sign of that's an element of Victorianism in his makeup. People complained that his entertainments, his dinners, were very economical. But of course, he was very much against public frugality. I mean, that's personal frugality. Public frugality was not. He hated the penny pinching Treasury. He thought that the state should be quite lavish in its provision of culture and education and things like that. He also had a very, very strong sense of duty, and that came out of his Victorian upbringing. He would have thought it wrong to devote your life purely to personal enrichment if the world was going to pot. He was drawn into the management of the world by the First World War, essentially. His early training was as a philosopher, not as an economist, and taking after his father, who was an important logician of that period. He was very, very bright. Bertrand Russell, on him, Keynes's intellect was the sharpest and clearest I have known. This is Bertrand Russell. Whenever I argued with him, I took my life into my hands. He believed in government by brains. He was a member of what Noel Allen has called the intellectual aristocracy, and he believed that politicians on the whole didn't have many brains, and therefore more the government should actually be in the hands of intelligence. And he thought intelligence could avert most problems. He wasn't anti-democratic, but he thought that the people had the right to be ruled by the best. And so I think that was another element in his makeup. He had extraordinarily efficient work habits, which most of us don't. He could switch from one thing to another very, very, very quickly without loss of concentration. And that's why he was able to accomplish so much in his life. Sometimes he switched too quickly, and I think there were, he always had a view on something. If someone raised a topic of conversation, Keynes would go off on a wonderful sort of fanciful account of this, and so he often seemed to come to his conclusions sometimes too quickly. Not his main economic conclusions, by the way, which he worked very, very hard on. In attitude to others, he was a mixture of benevolence and intolerance. He had great capacity for friendship, he was very loyal to friends, invariably kind to the young, but very rude to people who he thought, his own age, who should have known better. And so, of course, that put a lot of people off, because mostly he did. He spent a lot of his time with other people in public life who he sort of often left no doubt that in his mind they were idiots. He appreciated mental quirks, obsessions, oddities. He always thought there might be some interesting possibility in an odd remark. In other words, his mind didn't run along tram lines, which I think most of ours do. Thinking outside the box has been a phrase that very few people have the capacity or the willingness to think outside the box. He certainly did. He also had great respect for practical expertise, and he would always listen to someone who knew what they were talking about. And of course he was also, something we'll hear about later, he was very practically involved in the financial market. So I want to end just, one other point. He was very intuitive. He believed, not just intuitive in the sense that it used to be said that women are intuitive, but intuitive as a philosophical principle. He believed that your principles have to be based on a sort of intuition of how things were. He didn't really believe much in empirical verification, as has been mentioned earlier, because he didn't think he thought it was too weak. So there was an intuitive basis to his theory. Like Freud, he had scientific imagination, which can, I quote him on Freud, can body forth an abundance of innovating ideas, shattering possibilities, working hypotheses, which had sufficient foundation in intuition and common experience. His personal involvement in money-making, as I've just said, gave him experience in financial markets. One can wonder whether his general theory was tailored to a very specific situation. That is a criticism, and it's been called depression economics, but I think that's probably wrong, because I think the general theory could be, the guns could be pointed in either direction. And I end with a quotation from Kurt Singer, who was an economist who knew Keynes. He said he evoked by gesture, eye and word, the figure of a bird, of incredible swiftness, drawing circles in high altitudes, but of deadly precision when suddenly swooping down on some particular fact or thought, able to coin unforgettable word formulas. He was a brilliant user of language, and therefore a brilliant persuader, for what he saw, forcing his intellectual booty with iron grips, even on the unwilling.
Thank you very much. And John is going to speak. He's going to speak from the left. I think we will comfy doing that.
My topic is Keynes as an investor. I'm going to start with some extracts from Keynes's 1937 Quarterly Journal of Economics article, The General Theory of Employment, in which he responded to critical reviews of his book, The General Theory. That article is relevant in the context of this conference because in it, Keynes summed up the main grounds of his departure from traditional theory. Surprising as it may seem, there were only two, of which I'll be concerned with the second. The two grounds were, first, the orthodox theory has ignored the need for a theory of the supply and demand for output as a whole. Second, the orthodox theory assumes that we have a knowledge of the future of a kind quite different from that which we actually possess. In both that article and the general theory, Keynes talks of uncertain knowledge. What does he mean? And I'm quoting now. By uncertain knowledge, let me explain. I do not mean merely to distinguish what is known for certain from what is only probable. The game of roulette is not subject in this sense to uncertainty, nor is the prospect of a victory bond being drawn. The sense in which I am using the term is that in which the prospect of a European war is uncertain, or the price of copper and the rate of interest 20 years hence, or the obsolescence of a new invention. About these matters, there is no scientific basis on which to form any calculable probability whatsoever. We simply do not know. So what is to be done? Keynes continues, and again I'm quoting, nevertheless, the necessity for action and for decision compels us as practical men to overlook this awkward fact and to behave exactly as we should if we had behind us a good Benthamite calculation of a series of prospective advantages and disadvantages, each multiplied by its appropriate probability, waiting to be summed. What's Keynes saying here? That we deal with uncertainty, a state of affairs where we do not know the distribution of future outcomes, as if it were risk, a state of affairs where we do, or assume that we do, know the distribution of outcomes. And the implications? Keynes continues. The hypothesis of a calculable future leads to a wrong interpretation of the principles of behaviour which the need for action compels us to adopt, and to an underestimation of the concealed factors of utter doubt, precariousness, hope and fear. A prime example of this is the series of events in 2007 to 2009 and what led up to them. To bear out my point, I refer to the British Academy's letter to H.M. the Queen of July 2009, from which any reference to Keynes is conspicuous by its absence. To my mind, Keynes' epistemological approach provides a devastating critique of mainstream financial economics from Harry Markowitz's 1952 Journal of Finance article onwards. That article, you may recall, was entitled Portfolio Selection, in which he introduced the concept of a so-called efficient portfolio, the optimal risk-return combination. In the Quarterly Journal of Economics article, but especially in Chapter 12 of the General Theory, Keynes gives an account of the operation of organised asset markets, emphasising the role of liquidity. As long as an individual subscribes to what he calls the convention, that the basis of valuation won't change, he, that is the individual, can convince himself that The only risk he runs is that of a genuine change in the news over the near future. So he need not lose his sleep because he has not any notion what his investment will be worth 10 years hence. Liquidity enables individuals to come to terms with uncertainty, but at the price of having to concentrate on the short term. Keynes is talking here about the layman, but then goes on to argue that this short-term focus is also a characteristic of the behaviour of, quotes, expert professionals possessing judgment and knowledge beyond that of the average private investor. Most of these expert professionals, quotes, are in fact largely concerned not with making superior long-term forecasts of the probable yield of an investment over its whole life, but with foreseeing changes in the conventional basis of valuation a short time ahead of the general public, end of quote. Does this sound familiar as a description of portfolio manager behaviour even these days? Continuing Keynes's point, this short-term focus is the inevitable result of investment markets organised with a view to so-called liquidity. We know what Keynes thought. First, again quoting, of the maxims of orthodox finance, none surely is more antisocial than the fetish of liquidity. And second, quote, it forgets that there is no such thing as liquidity of investment for the community as a whole, as Charles Chuck Prince, CEO of Citigroup, found out in 2007. In chapter 12 of the General Theory, Keynes then goes on to draw the important distinction between speculation, the activity of forecasting the psychology of the market, and investment, the activity of forecasting the prospective yield of assets over their whole life. Pardon me. As he makes clear in the 1938 memorandum prepared for the Estates Committee of King's College, Cambridge, where in 1924 he was appointed first bursar, in effect manager of the college's endowment portfolios, Keynes had initially been a speculator, practicing what he called credit cycling. This involved, quotes, selling market leaders on a falling market and buying them on a rising one. And, as he observed, after allowing for expenses and loss of interest, it needs a phenomenal skill to make much out of it. To cut to the quick, from the early 1930s onwards, Keynes became an investor. In chapter 12 of the General Theory, Keynes explains how the odds are stacked against the investor, if I may speak colloquially. In the 1938 memorandum, he reminds us, quote, that it is true, unfortunately, that the modern organisation of the capital market requires for the holder of quoted equities much more nerve, patience and fortitude than from the holder of wealth in other forms. I wonder how many members of the King's Estates Committee understood Keynes's profoundly perceptive observation that, quotes, it is safer to be a speculator than an investor in the sense of the definition which I once gave the committee. A speculator is one who runs risks of which he is aware, and an investor is one who runs risks of which he is unaware. This, of course, takes us back to the question of uncertain knowledge, which is where I began. To conclude, perhaps members of the audience here feel that this general philosophical disquisition on the behaviour of mankind is somewhat remote from the topic under discussion, but I think not. Adopting a Zola-esque tone, I accuse conventional portfolio theory of being one of the pretty polite techniques made for a well-panelled boardroom and a nicely regulated market, which tries to deal with the present by abstracting from the fact that we know very little about the future. Thank you.
John, thank you very much. I have to say, someone who sat on a local authority investment committee, which actually invests the funds for the pension fund for the better part of 30 years, I sometimes say, you know, the town hall in Kensington, we've seen every snake oil salesman come through the door, and I have a lot of sympathy. But they aren't all snake oil salesmen, and I'm absolutely delighted that we're now going to be joined by David, who for many years worked for Henderson, which was one of the Royal Borough's portfolio managers, and it was a very long and very happy relationship. So he's also a very experienced financial journalist as well. John. Sorry, David.
Thanks, Mike. As Warwick said, one of my colleagues it was who looked after Kensington to Chelsea. I had the great honour of looking after the City of Westminster for many years, but I had 30 years roughly as a fund manager, looking after pension funds, charities and endowments from a UK equity perspective. So I thought I'd try and place Keynes's investing experience specifically in running the King's College discretionary portfolio, where he had freedom to invest as he wished in a modern institutional context, and also maybe have a quick look at some of his investment style characteristics and relate those to modern experience and modern thinking. I thought I'd start with quite a maybe possibly controversial statement, but I don't think it is really. I think if Keynes had been managing the discretionary portfolio in our modern era of rigorous governance, investment committees such as Warwick's at Kensington and Chelsea, then I think he would probably have been sacked by 1928. And in fact, I think it's highly likely he wouldn't have survived the second year in charge, when he underperformed by 21% relative to the index, which I think Elroy and his colleagues have back calculated. In value terms, over that first 7 years or so in charge, he did pretty well. In absolute terms, he turned £100 into, by my numbers, about 269, which is an excellent return. And the index would have beaten him by turning it into 321. So he was well behind the index during this period, when he was adopting a more of a shorter-term speculative approach, top-down macro investing style. The volatility during this period as well was far more than a modern-day board of trustees would have stomached. As I said, he was down 21% in his second year, which I mean, I would expect to be out the door if anything like that with a new client. He also had two other big relative drawdowns against the index of 25 and 16%. So 3 really horrible years out of his first 7, offset by only one good one. I mean, there were a few things that changed that saved his bacon, so to speak. I think, as I say, the fund did make good absolute returns, and they comfortably beat the returns achieved in the restricted portfolio, which he'd broken away from in this discretionary portfolio. And that, from the Board of Trustees' point of view, was probably what they were measuring him against. And to be perfectly fair, he made that asset allocation decision to move away from heavy bond property orientation into equities. So, full marks for the asset allocation decision. But in terms of running an equity portfolio benchmarked against an index, which of course we didn't have at that time, his job was clearly unsatisfactory. What actually happened then, though, as was already touched on, is that he turned things around. In the final 18 years in charge, he produced some absolutely stunning returns, some really excellent returns. And a large part of that was a change in his investment process. I think from reading, probably informed by the crash in 29, which he didn't invest well over, and that disappointing run of earlier returns. Now, personally, I wasted hundreds of hours of my investment career obsessing over macro and top-down and listening to economists and so on. And when I look back, it made sense at the time, it's quite seductive, but when I look back, I don't think it added any value at all, really. Macro investing is very, very hard to do with any consistency. Off the top of our heads, we can think of dozens of really talented bottom-up stock pickers. But I can only really think of a couple of Soros, maybe Tudor Jones, are probably the only two who spring to mind as being household name top-down guys. I think Keynes's shift to an approach which was more bottom-up, focusing on investing in companies, backing them in big size, is very telling, and it certainly echoes with my own personal investment experience and journey that I've been on over this long period of time. It's very much an approach that I've grown to adopt myself. And the quote that really struck home to me was, that as time goes by, this is speaking later in his career, as time goes by, I get more convinced that the right approach is to back in size, in other words, back your judgment, companies that you really know about and management you believe in. Now, I mean, that could easily have been written by Warren Buffett, who's regarded as our greatest modern investor, and he's very much a long-term investor rather than a short-term speculator. And I think generally the academic research and intermediaries would agree that a bottom-up stock-picking approach is generally regarded nowadays as having the best prospects of giving you an edge against the market, knowing your companies and backing your judgment. A couple of other things I'd point out as well about Keynes in his latter period: low trading activity. He traded very actively in the early period, creating lots of frictional costs. Laterally, much more buy and hold approach. Again, that's all fully backed up now by our decades of research and so on in terms of winning investment strategies. I'll just make a couple of other points as well about the hassles that you have as a professional fund manager. You're typically part of a team. You have to play by the team rules. You might have to adopt a house view of things. Keynes, in contrast, was very much a solo investor, fully backed by his committee and allowed to get on with it, and that creates a lot of freedom for you to back your judgment to the hilt and not be second guessed by colleagues. As a professional fund manager, there's this well-known concept of career risk. And I think a comment was made earlier about failing conventionally as being perfectly acceptable. And if you underperform by owning Vodafone and Shell and all the other names everybody knows about, then you can kind of excuse yourself. If you fail by owning lots of obscure, unheard of stocks, well, you've got less of a leg to stand on. So the professional has all these constraints, which Keynes was able to free himself from and pursue what I think are generally regarded as winning strategies. I'll just finish with one point. Somebody of my generation, it's quite interesting. Keynes, I think, does not have the profile amongst UK investors. I think he deserves, and just reading up ahead of this conference today. My generation, I tend to regard George Ross-Gooby as our spiritual forebear, and he famously took charge of the Imperial Tobacco Pension Fund in Bristol shortly after the Second World War, and running against the conventional wisdom of the time, he moved it into equities during the 1950s, away from bonds and so on. It was an absolutely brilliant decision, and is rightly lauded for it, and very much going against conventional wisdom. But actually, in hindsight, he was really only following Keynes's lead from 20 odd years earlier. So I think he does deserve a much higher status, I think, generally within the way we think about investors in the UK.
Yeah, I'm sure that's absolutely right. I first take an interest in Keynes as an investor largely because of Tim Congdon, who actually directed my attention both to his review of that book by Edgar Smith, demonstrating the relative returns of bonds versus equities, which I think was published in the UK in the 1920s, certainly reviewed in the 1920s, and also that gem of a letter, which I was telling my colleagues at Policy Exchange, that's why you saw me pointing in that direction, that gem of a letter to the Estates Committee of King's College that John and David referred to. But my own tutor always told a very interesting story about the 1950s, being an undergraduate in Cambridge, being lectured by Sir Dennis Robertson. And when the Church of England decided they would no longer have their full investment portfolio invested solely in bonds, or consols I think they called them then, they were going to move over to equities. Apparently, Sir Dennis said, when you can't fool the Church of England anymore, you can't fool anyone. And I think it's a very neat time to actually bring Elroy Dibson in. There's got to be a bit of moving around so we can see the pictures. Now, Mr. Tom will take charge of all of that for us.
You don't think you
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's for everyone except you. Position myself here. Can we turn these lights out and give it half a chance? Yes.
You're doing a decent job.
Close enough.
Okay. So, King's College is the photograph that those who come as tourists think of the photograph of Cambridge University. So, King's College, where Keynes spent his time from leaving high school until his death. And what I want to talk about is the theme of this final session, which is Keynes as the art connoisseur and Keynes as the investor. So a lot has been written about this, and perhaps the most notable contributions will be familiar to you. So this is Lord Skidelsky's extended biography of Keynes in 3 volumes. This is part of a thrust which has made people take account of Keynes as an investor. An attribute of a man that was, I think, given second priority until relatively recently. So although we had in the Moggeridge collected works a large proportion of what the man had written, we had these books like the Justin Walsh book or the John Wycett book, which have come out lately and have joined the industry of, if you were alive now, what would Keynes be telling us to do, which is actually quite a big industry. This is largely due to a conversation which you may not recall with my colleague at Cambridge, David Chambers, gave rise to an interest in Keynes as an investor. And we've done a number of studies in this area, one in Journal of Economic Perspectives, as an innovator in investment, one in an NBER publication and an associated book on his management of the King's College Endowment, another one in Journal of Financial and Quantitative Analysis, focusing on the quantitative analysis in which we had collected all of his transactions on behalf of the college and also himself. And so we were able to bring new evidence to light for that. And a somewhat tongue-in-cheek article in Financial Analyst's Journal telling Americans how the idea of the US endowment model actually came out of King's College in Cambridge and not out of anywhere in the United States. But there are others who've looked at other aspects of it. Keynes left his artworks subject to them staying in the house where his wife could enjoy them during her lifetime, but he gave them to King's College. And shortly after the bequest was made available, and most of it is in the Fitzwilliam Museum, there was a lovely exhibition assembled of the artworks, not limited simply to paintings, but to three-dimensional objects, manuscripts, and so forth, which had been left as a bequest to his college. On the right, you've got another book on Keynes, which also describes Keynes as an investor. And in the middle, a quite recent historical book, which those who are close to Keynes research will already have read, but it is quite new, and some of you may not have seen it, which is The Seven Lives of John Maynard Keynes, and it's a wonderful historian's approach to the Keynes story. He had acquired lots of artworks. He had good taste in some measure through his friends, through Duncan Grant. These are paintings which he had acquired, but they're paintings of his friends and his lovers, Vanessa Bell and Roger Fry. And perhaps his first big initiative was at the end of the First World War. France was in a bit of a mess, but it was due to pay some money to the British government. And with Treasury colleagues, he went along thinking, well, he's going to end up with French Treasury bills, and he could foresee what was going to happen to the value of French securities. But people were also not clamouring to spend the money which they no longer had on French artworks. So there were 3 sales by Degas of his collection, and he bought a number of these sales for himself and for the college, ultimately, and also works that you can see in the National Gallery, for those of you who are visitors to London, you see for yourselves. Bought a lovely Braque, which is recently on loan in Paris, a Seurat, which is in the Fitzwilliam Museum, probably the most valuable of the paintings. You got Matisse, Picasso. And underlying all of this, there was a view about how he would invest. And so the values that he had as an investor carried over somewhat to his view of the world of the arts. And so we have these books that have been looked at. Let me look at David Scrace and Peter Croft's remarks on him. I think this is probably written by David Scrace. All these pictures, he wrote, were bought cheaply. And there's no doubt that Keynes, much as he came to love his pictures, was also motivated in his purchases by his idea of art as an investment. So this book was the catalogue for the collection that was shown in the museum, opposite where I work, opposite the Dutch Business School in Cambridge, which basically celebrated this acquisition. They were all brought together, a very large proportion of these works. And what struck the curators was that he also, when one delved into the history of it all, was a little bit like somebody buying a stock and being interested in whether they were paying a higher or lower price earnings multiple to buy the company. And Dostala writes similarly. Most of these acquisitions were obtained at low prices, and it's certain that Keynes saw them also as investments. He preferred buying from auctions than directly from artists, which was more economical. So he liked buying cheap. Keynes was an ardent record keeper. Anything you want to know, there were things scribbled on pieces of paper. I don't know whether one or two of you may have seen this and scribbled before. I'm sure you have. But any guesses for those that haven't seen it before as to what these scribbled numbers might be?
Price.
Sorry?
Price.
Prices? They could have been, but they're not.
I need to see
Are they
them.
golf
Yes.
scores?
They are golf scores.
Ah.
So this should be good news to many of us, because many of us are economists, and we have no hope of competing with Lord Keynes as an economist. But a number of you would be better than Keynes on golf. So this is, the years 1899, 1900, 1911, he's running through the years, keeping a record of the scores that he gets, and then he totals them up. And he was doing this with all sorts of things.
Like his father. Father did the same.
Yes, and
They played golf against each other and all that, really.
and like his love life, he
Like his
is, so everything was scored, everything was reported. So there's a lot of data in the archives, and one of the secrets of doing archival research is that archivists spend a lot of time organising material, and when you access it, they're mostly not doing you a favour. You're doing them a favour. They love to have people taking an interest in what they've assembled and ultimately publishing on the strength of it. And so the archivists at King's College are remarkably helpful. So we dig through all of the archives, and this is a picture of a catalogue from Sotheby's. There's a date down there. It's April 1937. And we can look through, and I've just circled the date up there, and we can see what happened in a particular sort of transaction. And why is that knocking around? Well, down at the bottom, it has Keynes, JM, and the price that was paid for a couple of the artworks that he bought. And so we were able to go through his artworks and identify what all except the personal gifts, which were typically things of little value, or occasional prints, which were of even less value, had cost. And so we've got a record from when he started making purchases all the way through to his death. And so this is an indication year by year, the number of purchases, what he'd spent, and the most costly item in each of those years. This is data that we've pulled together with a motivation of looking at his art investments in the same sort of way as we've looked at his financial investments in a number of different studies. I wanted to show you one graph which appeals to us. This is a graph in which we take what was paid and we ask two questions. What would it be worth in 2013, adjusting for inflation all the way through? So this is the real or inflation-adjusted value on the horizontal axis. And on the vertical axis, what would happen if you had invested it in equities, reinvesting the income? And so you can see there's a 45-degree line there. Mostly, his art investments would have done better if invested in equities. That's because you're getting a financial dividend, and for artworks you're getting a psychic dividend, and that's all. But there's the odd one over there. And there are occasional real hits. There are occasions where he's done remarkably well. This is a characteristic of art collections.
Is that the Grand Jat?
That is indeed. So you could work back to any of these outliers. The one condition that was placed on our work in this is that we don't highlight in our eventual published work just which ones are what the current valuations are, the most valuable ones, and that's because the bursar, as well as the people at the museum, don't want to help anybody who comes in with a large rucksack and spirits worked out. So we've been able to look at performance over a variety of different intervals, and that's because not only do we have what he paid, but we have evaluations and intervening periods in between. We have a portfolio which was acquired over a period of time and then held on a buy and hold basis. This is rather different from any other collection, and where uniquely we obtain valuations of the artworks not from one, but from quite a number of leading art valuation firms, so the top ones there are. And we were able, therefore, also to learn something about disagreements between valuers as well. So here's what happened to the Keynes collection over time. In black, what you can see is the estimated value of the collection. And then we've got a probate valuation, insurance valuations, government indemnity scheme, sort of insurance valuation, and then open market valuations on the right-hand side. So the numbers that we start with on the left are exactly what he paid. The numbers on the right are the valuations based on 5 leading firms. In yellow colour, you can see what the real value was of his expenditure, so that's inflation adjusted, and so the black bars are well ahead of what he spent. He purchased wisely, and the blue bars are what would have happened if he'd invested in equities, not spent the dividends, but held on to the dividends, had reinvested them costlessly and without paying a management fee. So perhaps in reality would have been a little bit trimmed off from that. So this is really quite remarkable that for a non-dividend bearing portfolio to fully match a costlessly run equity index fund is astonishing. So what was his performance like? The annualized real buy and hold returns from purchase to 2013. We may do one more valuation before this article is finished. It'll probably be 2018. Value weighted, that is weighted by the valuation of each artwork, was 4.7%, equally weighted 3.9%. It does look as though during his lifetime he was a skilled operator. Many people would claim to be buying cheap in the market. You can't have everybody buying cheaper than everybody else. But in the art market, he was operating in an illiquid market that was quite opportunistic on a number of his purchases. So the real buy and hold return, with starting in 1959 and moving beyond the probate valuation, the first one that's available, 4.2%, equities 6%, including dividends. He performed very well. So I was just going to share a few remarks. This is a photograph looking out from Cambridge Judge Business School to the other side of the road, and it's only 6 days old. And what it says over here on these banners is, make this the year you visit, and you can go and see the Keynes art collection, none of which has been sold, and it's largely at the museum, and it's sort of like a nice way, if you're interested in Keynes, to round off your experience of the man. So those are my remarks, and thank you very much.
Well, maybe we should reassemble, but turn the light off so we don't have the light in our eyes when we sit there. So we can round up with some questions. Thank you very much for that. I promised our head of arts, who's sitting at the back, that it was worth coming because Keynes did have a significant role in the arts. I think he's the first chair of the Arts Council. And that wasn't my doing, Lindsay. Elroy he could have done all sorts of things about Keynes, and he chose to actually exemplify that. Which I think is an indicator of the breadth of the man. Where would you like to go before you have a frugal Keynesian lunch courtesy of Policy Exchange? John.
So I'd like to ask about his relationship to the Bloomsbury group, and not for reasons of sexual titillation, of course. If you can sort of elaborate on this rather interesting array of lovers that was referred to.
Well, I think this gets to probably the most controversial part of the man's life. I I'm not the best qualified to comment on it, but I will tell you how I ended up doing this study. I was talking about this with my first cousin. My first cousin is a woman called Wendy Barron. She was a curator for the Government Art Collection. Her PhD at the Courtauld was on the Bloomsbury group, and all of her books are around Sickert, Bloomsbury group, and other aspects of that. And she said, well, I've got a manuscript that David Grace gave me for half of the written work, which was going into a catalogue. I never did see the catalogue, she said, but it was for a collection that Keynes had left as his legacy to the college. Have you ever looked at that? And I said, no. So she gave me a faded photocopy. I became aware, really, of this connection and its importance in Keynes's life.
I think just to add to that, he admired, I mean, he idolized artists. He thought they were on a much higher level than economists. In one rather famous remark from the economic possibilities for our grandchildren, he ended by saying, I hope that one day economists will become as useful as dentists.
We should hope.
We hope, yeah. I mean, he placed the arts on a very high place, arts and philosophy, but perhaps the studies to which he gave supreme allegiance.
Rebecca. Rebecca works for Policy Exchange, she's one of us.
MP.
Carry on from what you said about philosophy, I was wondering if you could maybe say something about the influence of G.E. Moore on Maynard Keynes, and perhaps whether this sort of early exposure to this growing 20th century focus on analytic philosophy, what influence this had on his sort of intellectual thought.
Well, G. Moore's influence was incredibly powerful. I think it gave Keynes his ethical foundations, his idea of what a good life was, the distinction between being good and doing good. It was the foundation of his work, criticizing Moore, the foundation of his work on probability, which led him to write a treatise on probability. And I think his idea that knowledge was based on intuitive, that it was good was indefinable in Moore, and from that he got the idea that one's knowledge, the most important knowledge one has, is a priori knowledge. I think all those he got from Moore.
Just say your name.
Thank you. Tony Halmos, King's College London, but part of the Policy Institute, which is in the Virginia Woolf building at King's, because she was also part of the Bloomsbury group, but she was a student at King's. My question is this, both yourselves and then some of the previous comments in the other panels touched on Keynes' view of what is economics or what is the role of economists. I wondered whether you would like to speculate on his view of the current controversy swirling around the economics profession and economics teaching, with groups popping up in universities to demand new approaches to economics and so on. Is there a link between current stuff and the debates were going on around this time?
Well, if I may answer that, I think one's got to distinguish between him I distinguish between policy Keynesians and fundamentalist Keynesians. I mean, it's not my own distinction, but I mean, it's a well-known one. He was very interested in policy, in making sure that slumps don't happen, and he was prepared to compromise on theory in order to get that. He wanted policy to be practical, and his policy proposals were designed to be implemented. At the theoretical level, he would have been very critical of the new Keynesians, because he would have said that they missed the fundamental interpretation of his book, which in the first of the presentations centred on irreducible uncertainty. And of course, what the new Keynesians have done basically is to adopt the neoclassical synthesis and have produced optimizing foundations for their macroeconomics, which are then made to work by inserting wage and price rigidities, nominal wage and price rigidities. So you can get a Keynesian policy out of it, but at the expense of some incoherence. And that, in the end, undermined the case for Keynesian fiscal and monetary policy, because you can't get persistent unemployment out of optimizing foundations. It just doesn't. And so, in a way, he would have been very, very critical of that. I think he would have now seen more merit in Hayek than he did at the time, because they were fighting these very fierce battles. He would probably have seen a lot of merit in Schumpeter as well. He would not have seen much merit in Dennis Robertson's persistent preference for bonds.
And no, as I understand it, Dennis Robertson actually was rather congratulated the Treasury for jumping the bonds.
Yeah, but that was maybe later in life. But the thing about Dennis Robertson in Cambridge in his heyday was Dennis prefers bonds.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Play on words, obviously.
Yeah, but, just adding to what Robert Skidelsky said, I, as an outsider, sense increasing attempts over the last 1 or 2 decades by the economics profession to return to a more sensible, a more correct interpretation of what Keynes actually wrote. And, for example, the idea that involuntary unemployment is attributable to wage rate rigidity is in fact a gross misrepresentation of what's in the general theory. If we're going to reduce it to just one cause, then involuntary unemployment is the result of uncertainty and the way that people deal with uncertainty. And that's a very broad brush remark on which we could have a seminar or an entire conference.
So you want to be president or honorary president of the student group that's been set up?
As a what?
The honorary president of the student group that's been set up to try and change
The curriculum.
change the curriculum. This current controversy.
Started at Manchester.
Manchester University, start exactly all of that. Where there's, I don't know where it's got to.
Well, it's
don't
going.
see him as their hero almost. That's what I was
It's going. But the economics profession is fundamentally very, very strongly entrenched in a particular way of doing things and a particular view of the world. It goes all the way back to the beginning of scientific economics. It's very hard to overthrow it. I mean, it'll be overthrown one day if it may be overthrown just by becoming irrelevant. Frontal assault isn't likely.
Well, there were frontal assault. I mentioned it right at the start of the session this morning. There is quite an assault from Paul Romer at the moment, in that lecture he gave in New York, saying there's been no progress in economics over the last 50 years. All the identification problems are as bad as they've ever been, and I mean, so there's a bit of trouble there.
Better late than never.
But, could I ask a question about, this is very much Keynes' personality. I'm conscious he was a Victorian. He and many of his friends and many of his circle would go to an exhibition at the National Gallery about Virginia Woolf. I was struck how many of them died in their mid-40s, their mid-50s. He didn't make old bones like his parents. Yet when I read his letters and things he got up to and the people he was rude to, he just feels like some of the people that Joe and Nick and I have worked with at the Treasury and fooled around with. Although I'm not sure you're right.
I have the wrong phrase.
He strikes me as, in sensibility, quite an accessible and modern figure. Now, is that a totally, I think in the proper meaning of the word, anachronistic reading of Keynes, or am I right that he does still speak to a modern sensibility?
Oh yeah, I think he does, and he was very clear about that in some of his essays. he looked forward to much more liberation from the Victorian codes. I've always wondered what he would have, how he would have turned out had gay marriage existed in his day. I mean, he wasn't a complete homosexual. I think, you know, he was on a continuum, but I think he probably preferred men to women. And if he had had a chance, and it hadn't, and no huge stigma had been attached to it, I sometimes wonder how he would have fallen. But certainly, in many respects, the whole Bloomsbury group were precursors of the 60s and of many of the liberating things that have happened since.
Are there any more questions, or is that the right moment to bring up Vicky? I'm so sorry.
Thank you very much. I actually reviewed the 7 Lives of John Maynard Keynes for the Independent and really enjoyed it. It's got an interesting thing about work. We were talking about work earlier and the number of hours and how, of course, they've been reduced in the year. And I found it quite interesting that he was a very clever man, obviously, because he decided to go to the India office. As you probably know, this was had quite a high prestige, but very few working hours. So what he managed to do is work in an industry which worked only 11 to 5 p.m. on weekdays, 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. on Saturday. He had an hour for lunch, 2 months annual holiday, and remission from attendance on bank holidays and Derby Day. So he used all his time to, in fact, write his treatise on probability, which of course we've been hearing about before. So I thought that was very, very astute, but maybe it coloured his view of how one could work leisure and look at leisure in the future.
Can I just add one comment on that? He ended up in the India office apparently because of a mistake. Because he took the civil service exams and he was the second best candidate in the country. And I can only imagine that he would have judged this as a failing by the examiners to have failure to identify the very best.
He did. He regarded it as a great failure on the part of the examiners. He got his worst marks in economics. And he wrote the examiners were completely incompetent. But it did have consequences because the successful candidate who did join the Treasury was someone called Otto Niemeyer. And Otto Niemeyer was one of the architects of the Treasury view. So there was a big personal conflict in the 20s between number 1 and number 2.
I'll just ask Lars Skidelsky what he thinks Keynes would have made of how much is enough. We need to broaden what good looks like in the future.
Sorry, what?
What would Keynes have made of the book? Your book?
How much is that? I hope you would have liked it. As it's based on economic possibilities for our grandchildren.
We've written a review in the Independent for it.
You did?
There would be.
There would, yeah.
To what extent, though, do you think that Keynes, with his sense of personal frugality, public consumption, when I worked at the Treasury, and something that my boss Nigel Lawson someone said to me, Treasury officials were perfectly happy when people were sitting around singing madrigals, but when they wanted to buy a sports car or get on a motorboat, they weren't so keen on that. And actually the big difference is, out there are a lot of people who want to be in Harrods this afternoon, and in Fortnum & Mason's, and in the Westfield Centre, doing the sorts of things that your average Treasury official isn't quite so enthusiastic about. And to what extent did he have a rather recherché notion of how we should all be occupying ourselves than the one that real people who are real flesh and blood with a football want to get on with life?
Well, you hoped that would come, you see. I mean, he thought that, historically there'd always been a group that had been exempt from, physical toil and having to earn their living. I mean, they fulfilled their duties in other ways, but they'd been exempt from that, and he hoped that would spread with the increase in wealth and the diffusion of wealth, and that others would learn this game, as he put it in Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. So it was an ideal of civilization. It was an ideal of civilization. it was too limited. It left out, as was said in the previous session, it left out many things, but still it was an ideal, and it was an ethical ideal of what a good life was.
Well, thank you all very much for coming to speak to us. I'd like to thank all our speakers who've come. I'd also like to thank our audience as well. At this stage of events in policy exchange, I often say, as a think tank, we can't do it without a lot of help. And that help speakers, people prepared to write things for us, and people prepared to actually come and interrogate our speakers, ask questions, and interact with them. We can't do it all on our own inside here, and we are very, very grateful when people come, give up their time, and again to be with us. So really I say thank you very much indeed. I hope you found it interesting. I certainly found it fascinating, and we're very pleased to have had you all here today. Thank you very much. And I also have a very special thanks to the team here at Post Exchange who really did the doing of it all. Jonathan DuPont and Tom, who really were absolute stars in this, interrupted and messed up by me. And I really am very, very grateful indeed. Thank you very much.